Welcome to the All Things Bright and Beautiful podcast. I'm Jenna here with my co-host Lydia Shively, and this is a discussion of life, books, and theology from a confessionally reformed Christian perspective. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the book The Screwtape Letters, written by author C.S. Lewis and first published in 1942. We'll be covering topics like time, worldliness, and mortality. We hope that you enjoy today's episode. Welcome back to the All Things Bright and Beautiful podcast. I am Jenna and I am sitting here with Lydia Shively.
Hello.
Lydia, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Doing well. Today, we are going to be discussing The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And The Screwtape Letters is one of C.S. Lewis's most famous works. He published other books like Mere Christianity and The Chronicles of Narnia. And he was actually a professor at both Oxford and Cambridge in the early to mid 1900s. And he came out with the Screwtape Letters in 1942. And since it came out, it has been continuously republished since then. So it has been very popular and very well loved, and still today I would say is very well loved. And so we are really looking forward to diving into the Screwtape Letters with you today.
Yeah, so Screwtape Letters is probably one of the most well-known. I feel like most people I know who've read Lewis have heard of the Screwtape Letters or read them. And it was popular when it came out, although there were a lot of people that didn't recognize that it was satire when it came out. It came out in like periodical in a newspaper about like weekly. That's why it's like the individual letter form. So they came out kind of separately at the time. But there were a lot of people that were really offended by it initially because they didn't recognize that it was sort of this ironic satire. So it's written from the perspective of Dr. Screwtape, the uncle of Wormwood, and he's writing these letters to Wormwood in order to instruct him on how to tempt his patient.
Because Wormwood is like he's an amateur demon.
Yeah, he's like a new up and coming demon, I guess. So he writes these letters in order to teach him sort of the ins and outs of how to tempt humans and how to draw them away from who he calls the enemy, which is God, and away from the faith.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember this is a fictional work, and it's supposed to be, as you said, a satire, and it's supposed to shed light on truths about how Satan and his demons interact and how, spiritual warfare potentially could happen in the world, but it's not a doctrine of demonology or something like that. Like, we need to make sure we understand it is a work of fiction that certainly has a lot of valuable truths in it, but that we shouldn't hold Lewis to this standard of like a theological
we're not getting
work.
our theology of demons from Screwtape Letters. And I think even when you read it, it is kind of offensive. I never get used to reading the enemy as God and like don't feel sort of a pang against that. But I think that's his intention in writing it, is to sort of startle us into this world of godlessness, of what does it look like to really see God as your enemy, and that reality that there are forces, like you were saying, that exist like that.
And I think that's an important thing to note, that because we'll be reading some quotes and things throughout this, that when we say the enemy, we are referring to God, and that's because of in the satirical work, Lewis refers to God as the enemy, and then he talks a lot about the patient, who is the man that he is, that I guess Wormwood is trying to tempt. And so we see this man at the very beginning of the book, he's converted and becomes a Christian, and so it's kind of about his Christian walk throughout the years following his conversion. He falls in love, he has different experiences, and then they enter into a war, which this was actually, as we know, since it came out in 1942, it was written right after the thick of, or actually, I guess, during the thick of World War II.
Yeah, and I think by taking this just posture that he takes, Lewis allows us to sort of look at sins and temptations in sort of a new light that allows us to kind of maybe take a sharper eye to things that we're more commonly apathetic towards, things that we maybe have come used to. And by using this new angle as this demon's perspective, I think it gives us a better awareness of things that maybe we've grown used to.
Yeah, that was one of the things that really stood out to me just throughout the book, was that a lot of the temptations that the patient is tempted with are more subtle sins. So I think when we think of demonic activity or we think of being tempted by Satan, we usually think of these very overt big sins, but that's something Lewis emphasizes over and over again, is that it's usually subtle things and that we don't actually realize that it's happening. And so that's one of the reasons to read this book, I think, is it does open your eyes to things that you perhaps have never thought about could be ways that you could be tempted.
Yeah, and like you were saying, he takes these things that maybe we don't necessarily look at as sins. But and then I think when you think of a book written about a demon tempting you, you might be like, oh, he's going to like hit on sex, and he's going to hit on greed and murder and all these huge obvious sins. But what he really does, and it's not that he doesn't talk about those things, but he really gets at the heart of where those types of sins come from, and shows the other outpourings of that type of heart that leads to lust, and not just obvious sexual sins, or that leads to murder, but also anger towards your brother, or irritability even. Right. So he just really gets down into that heart and allows us to see where sin begins, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, one quote that I really love in the book says, let him begin by treating the patriotism or the pacifism as part of his religion. Then let him, under the influence of partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important part. Once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you have almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing. What did you make of this quote by Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, the patriotism and pacifism part is apt, but I think he's getting at a bigger idea. That's like one angle of what he's talking about, of really what he gets at. There's like a continued theme of this idea of people exchanging what he calls mere Christianity, or what we would probably call like Orthodox Christianity, like the basics of what it means to be a Christian, and exchanging them to tack on whatever ands we might add to it. And then by doing that, creating sort of a different religion and using Christianity as our like argument bolster in order to add to it. And later on he talks, I can't remember what chapter, it's chapter 25. He mentions the other ands, like he mentions a couple other ones. He talks about Christianity and the crisis, Christianity and new psychology, Christianity and the new order, and faith healing. And I'm sure we could add, a ton of other ones in our current age of just these ands that we add on in order to replace basic Christianity, I guess. And not that those are bad things. Like, I mean, when you talk about deep convictions, that's not a bad thing. It's just that twisting and changing where it flows from, I think.
Yeah, and I think we do see, I mean, certainly the point that he has brought up is very relevant to us today. Like, I was just thinking of what are ways that we see this in our culture today, and I'm sure there's many ways, but a few of the things that immediately came to my mind are the emphasis we see nowadays on social justice, which isn't inherently a bad thing. It's a good thing. But when it becomes social faith as a means to an end of social justice, then that isn't a good thing. Or kind of, I guess, on the other side, we see oftentimes the so-called religious right, trying to, I guess, guard traditional American values in a way that really, truly what they're doing is making their faith a means to an end of this political society that they hope to achieve. Right. And so I think it's certainly something all Christians are still prone to, and that we see is very prevalent in our society today. And so again, those things, social justice or being politically conservative aren't inherently bad things, but when they become this kind of faith and like you're talking about, rather than what Lewis calls mere Christianity, that's when we can go wrong. And
I think it's just really, it's a sneaky thing, right? Yeah. Because a lot of the things, like you mentioned, social justice, and even just like wanting a just and fair society, all those things aren't bad. It's just that flipping, and that's a lot of what these themes that he brings up in Screwtape are, is just this idea of flipping the order of things and disordering, like Augustine would say, like the disordering of loves, and just twisting it so that it's no longer about Christ. It just becomes about, like you were saying, using him as a means to an end.
Yeah, and I like Screwtape also talks about, when he's advising Wormwood, he says to make his patient so attached to the earth that he believes that the earth can be turned into heaven at some future date through something like politics or science or some other sort. And again, I think that's exactly the heart of what we're talking about, that it's not, those things aren't inherently wrong, but when we are trying to make heaven on earth, that just is never going to happen. This, we know until we get to glory, until we get to heaven, our society, our government, all of these things are going to be filled with sin because we do live in a sinful and fallen world. And that doesn't mean we don't try to, advocate for good changes,
right.
but we do that with our loves rightly ordered, as you said, recognizing that ultimately perfection will never be achieved on this earth. And so we can certainly strive for God's values and standards, but knowing that those are never going to be, I guess, a means to an end of our faith here on earth.
Right. Yeah, I think that especially like you were saying, like trying to bring heaven onto earth. I mean, the biggest thing that's missing in bringing heaven onto earth is like we don't have that relationship with God that we're meant for. And so anytime we try to usher in some sort of utopia, we're really trying to do that apart from him. And that misses the whole point of why we exist.
Absolutely. One of the things that Lewis does in each of his letters or his chapters is he tends to focus on an objective or a theme for that chapter. And so one of the repeated themes that we see throughout the book is the difference between Satan, or I think he refers to him often as our father throughout the book, and then the enemy or God. And so one thing that he says is that our Father below has drawn all other beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. What do you think about this idea, Lydia? But like the difference between, I guess, as he refers to our Father below and the enemy.
Yeah, I think it's just that's probably like my favorite part of the whole book. And he really threads it through all of it, and even into the later written Screwtape Proposes a Toast, I think is what it's called. And at Screwtape Proposes a Toast, they're getting ready to eat a meal of human souls that have been won over to darkness. And I just think that imagery of sort of Satan and darkness devouring us is a really strong one that he uses, and he contrasts it to God, who doesn't he brings people to himself, but they maintain their individuality. And so and Lewis kind of repeats that idea in Screwtape Letters and elsewhere in his writing of this idea but following God and being obedient to him and in submission to him makes us the most human that we are that's possible for us. And so it's the obedience actually brings us into our ultimate humanity, as opposed to Satan or evil that devours and sort of creates this compulsive nature in humans, which he deceives people by making them think that's more free, but it's actually you're enslaved to your compulsive desires. You don't have a choice anymore, whereas God brings out this choice of love, which is so distinct. And it's really distinct from a lot of other world religions. So you look at like Buddhism, that has everyone is joined up into nirvana and there's no longer any sort of individuality, or you have Hinduism where the person is changed completely every time they reincarnate. And so like you have Christianity that offers this distinction of, yes, you have to change and be made new, but you're still you. And I think that's just a really interesting and important distinction.
Right. I agree. I think, too, the fact, as you said, that we maintain our will, that God actually does desire for us to love him is something that really does stand out. And even, satirically, Screwtape kind of makes fun of that multiple times throughout the book and kind of doesn't understand that. But I think that is like Lewis's way of emphasizing how good God is, that he does desire for us to love him, that he does leave our will intact, and that he does want us to truly be his children, his unique children that he loves. And he says kind of in that same section, he just talks about how Satan wants to devour, his people, whereas God wants to fill them and wants to leave their, as you said, their kind of unique imago Dei, I guess you could say, attached, that he wants them to be uniquely his creature.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Screwtape sort of mocks this idea of God, that like he really does just want them. He really does want to love them, and he really does want to give them pleasure. And you have this distinction of Satan being the father of lies, and everything that he presents for Wormwood to do is deception. It's all tricking. In contrast to God, who really does do all the things that he says that he will do, and he really does want pleasure for his people, and he really does want to bring them into this far greater understanding of what pleasure is than what they sort of settle for in their sin. And so that idea of pleasure takes place in the book a lot too. There's a common thread. And one of the quotes that really stuck out to me was, I can't remember where it was, but it says, all we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasure which our enemy has produced at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural. What did you think of that quote and the idea of pleasure?
I really liked the I guess theme of pleasure that was weaved throughout the book as well. And I think our inclination is to think of pleasure as a negative thing that we kind of assume, well, that must be sinful. And it certainly, pleasure, it can become sinful, as Lewis points out. But that I like that he actually makes the point of attributing pleasure to the enemy. Like he says the enemy actually created pleasure, and that it's only when humans indulge in it in ways that he's forbidden that it becomes sinful. Right. But he was actually the ultimate creator of pleasure. And so I think, that's often when we're tempted, it's often with these subtle sins or these good gifts that God has given us. There's lots of different things we can think of: food, sex, many things that are good, but when they're used outside of the bounds that God has given us, or to a degree that he doesn't will, then that's when it becomes a sinful indulgence. And so he even, like, I can think of, he uses the example, I think it's the patient's mom in the book, and he talks about her gluttony, which in and of itself is interesting, because I feel like gluttony is not something like I ever really think about. But she is completely blinded to the fact that she actually is gluttonous, and she thinks because she doesn't eat a large amount of food, that she isn't gluttonous, but that in reality her whole life is kind of centered around food and having her toast just the way she wants it, and the tea and just the style that she likes, and she doesn't care how much inconvenience she causes everyone else, that she has to have exactly what she wants. And so that she actually is, her whole life is kind of focused on this sin of gluttony and of food, and she's completely blinded to it because food is inherently, it's a good gift from God, but that again, when it becomes ultimate, that's when it becomes sinful. And I also thought about another thing this kind of idea of pleasure made me think about was John Piper. If you're familiar with him at all, he emphasizes in a lot of his books, especially Desiring God, but really in several of his books, he talks about this idea of Christian hedonism. And hedonism in of itself is a secular idea about, achieving pleasure is the highest good that we can aim for in life. So Piper takes that secular idea and then talks about Christian hedonism, meaning that God desires for us to seek pleasure in him. And so he has this quote that he repeats a lot that says, he says, Christ is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And so that is, God's ultimate desire for us is to enjoy his good gifts and pleasures, but in Christ. Like, our ultimate pleasure is in him.
Yeah, and I think he also says later, he says the demons, their aim is to diminish pleasure and increase desire. And so that sort of offsetting of that idea of, like, God wants to give us pleasure, and what God's pleasure does when it's in these correct confines of what he's designed, it's this continual pleasure that's just always giving, and there's always more to it. Whereas this sinful, like, giving into, like, sinful desires and sinful indulgence doesn't lead to more pleasure. It's an all-consuming thing. I think the best example is like you were talking about, sex, and just this idea of lust versus it's a twisting. Like, the only thing you can do is twist love, and it becomes lust, and then lust is just all consuming. It's something that's just constantly need to be fed and is never satisfied, as opposed to when we have pleasure in God and in those rightful ways that he's designed it, we're satisfied in that, and we're satisfied in him ultimately. And I think that Lewis just expertly shows that in just a lot of contexts that maybe, like you brought up the patient's mother, and just context that you don't necessarily think about it very often, and you don't recognize, like, oh, that is me sort of twisting a pleasure in the wrong way. Yeah.
That's a great point, Lydia. And with any pleasure that God has created, he's created these good gifts for us. But anytime we try to find our ultimate joy or our ultimate pleasure in those things other than Christ, we're always going to be left wanting more. We're never going to be satisfied. Another theme that Lewis brings up is this idea of time. He brings that up a lot in the Screwtape Letters. So he says, the humans live in time, but our enemy destines them to eternity. He therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things, to eternity itself and to that point of time which they call the present. For the present is the point at which time touches eternity. What do you think we can learn about time from the issues he brings up in the book?
Yeah, I think time is such an interesting thing, and I think he brings it up a couple different times in ways that are really thought-provoking. But just thinking about this idea that we're supposed to have this tension of eternal thinking, but also being in the present. And I think that's what Jesus sort of gives when he gives the talk about not worrying about tomorrow, for tomorrow has enough worry of its own. Just basically be present in today and trust me with the rest, while also being kingdom-minded. You should be thinking about eternity and remembering that what you have right now is temporal. And I think if anyone is honest, if I'm honest, this idea of trusting God with tomorrow and not worrying about it, or not being so focused on past mistakes, it is that tension of faith, and you have to put into practice that idea of, I trust God's plan for whatever comes next, and I also trust his sacrifice for me for the sins and the things that I did mess up in the past, and allowing us to sort of live in the present time. I think that there's just a lot of sin that can be caught up in that, and a lot of fellowship with the Lord that can be caught up in it when we do it rightly.
Yeah. That stood out a lot to me too. And I am unfortunately someone that can often struggle with anxiety. So I think it especially stood out to me, just the emphasis that he places on being in the present. And I just found it fascinating that he talks about how the future is the least like eternity, that, the present or the past are really the present, I guess, is really where God wants us to be, and the future is least, least like eternity, least where God wants us to be or to live in our thoughts. And he just says, Screwtape says, when he's advising Wormwood to have the patient live in the future as much as possible, because the future inflames hope and it inflames fear, and it's unknown to him, and so it makes him think about these unrealities that haven't happened yet. And I think that is where and I know where I so often find myself, is living in the future and living out these hypothetical scenarios that haven't happened yet, and then sinning by giving into fear. And as you said, not following what Matthew 6 tells us to do, which is to be anxious, or to not be anxious about tomorrow, because tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. And he talks about this idea of like how he wants the human or the patient to be constantly pursuing the rainbow's end and never content with the present, because he's always looking for the future. So that's just another kind of idea of why living in the future is so tempting and bad for us, is because then it leaves us discontent, because we're never content with what we have in the present. And then another kind of facet of time that he brings up is this sense of ownership. And he says, let him have the feeling that he starts each day as the lawful possessor of 24 hours. The sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. And I found that so convicting personally, because that is absolutely how I usually think about my time, is that it's my own, that I have my day, I have my plans, I have my 24 hours before me, and that we forget that even our time is actually a gift from God, and that we're just to be stewards of it, and that any so-called interruptions or unplanned providences that he might bring into our life are actually his will for us, and that we should be joyful and content in those things and trust that he desires what's good and best for us, and that we should follow him, even in the midst of those interruptions or unexpected things, that's actually how he wants us to spend our time.
Yeah, I think that's one of like the easiest ways to fall into sin, is especially like with kids. Yes. When you think of your time, when you get up in the morning and you think today is mine.
And we both have young kids. We're both familiar with that.
Very familiar with that.
And probably sanctified a lot by that.
Yeah, because I think it's just really easy to look at those interruptions, like you said, as somehow encroaching on what belongs to me. But if we if we can change our thinking a little bit and think of it as like, no, my time belongs to God, then the way that we treat people will be very different, and we'll be a lot more open to those opportunities that, like you said, that he is designed to bring into our day. He says the quote, later along the same lines, he says, the man can neither make nor retain one moment of time. It all comes to him by pure gift. And so I think just being reminded of that, of like, we don't make our time, but it's so easy to think of it as belonging to us. And so being able to remember that this too is a gift, I think can just change our entire outlook on the entire day, I think. And help us to be a lot more kingdom minded, which is precisely what we should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so switching gears just a little bit from that, one of the other things that he brings up, it's in a couple of the different letters. One of the objectives that Screwtape has is to distract the patient from basically finding a healthy church and to just continue what he calls dating the church or church hopping. And the thing he says in chapter 16 is, surely you know that if a man can't be cured of church going, the next best thing is to send him all over the neighborhood looking for the church that suits him until he becomes a connoisseur of churches. What do you think of that quote and just that idea?
Yeah, I really liked that term, connoisseur of churches. I think that's really apt for what unfortunately I think so often happens. And I know I've seen, even in our own context, seen this time and time again. Unfortunately, people kind of just hopping from one church to another and becoming connoisseurs or kind of critics of churches and never, unfortunately, being satisfied anywhere that they are. And Screwtape says that the church should always be attacked because it is a place that brings together people of different classes and psychologies and brings them together in this kind of unity that the enemy desires. And so I think our inclination is always going to be to want to be around people like us. Yeah. But the church isn't a country club. It's not a group based on interests. It's not a group for all people who like the same thing. And so that often is uncomfortable for us, but because that is really our natural sinful inclination. But the beautiful and wonderful and glorious thing is that the church is the only place where a diverse group of people are brought together, and the only thing that unites them is Christ. And in addition, I think also there's so many one another commands that we see throughout Scripture. And really the only way of fulfilling many of those commands is by being meaningfully involved in a local church, and often for a long period of time. So not just, being involved for a year and then going to the next church. And obviously there's certain reasons why people might have to move around, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who do just become kind of a connoisseur of churches, as Lewis describes them. Yeah, exactly. And so we really should, I think the challenge in this is to seek to be meaningfully involved in a church for a long period of time, not because it meets all of our unique needs or interests, but because it's where God has called us to, it's where we're being fed, and it's where we can truly serve.
Yeah, I think he does a lot of really interesting parts where he sort of tries to tell Wormwood to kind of call attention to the idiosyncrasies of the different members of the church, and basically to play off of this like irritability in his so-called patient, and to just have an attitude towards his fellow churchmen that's just ungracious, and that he would never think of on himself, and he does that in other contexts. But I thought that was particularly interesting for the church, because I think we fall into that so easily, where we're so quick to assume the worst of people, or to pick out things that bother us, or like you were saying, just to be really critical of churches in general, and to be looking for this like you were saying, like country club almost, that just satisfies what we think that we want, instead of thinking like, where has God called me? I'm committed completely because this is where I belong, and I need to serve these people, and I think that's just such a with so much availability of churches in our age and where we live, it's a really easy thing to fall into. And I think it's just his like warning against that through Screwtape, I think, is a really helpful one for Christians to just really, I think Christians just are so quick to leave the body and so quick to say, no, I'm going to go find something different. But if we took our membership vows seriously, it would be something that would make us weep to even leave a church. Yeah. And I just think that's something that more Christians, especially our age, could take more seriously.
And that it really is disastrous for us spiritually. Like I've seen this play out firsthand, unfortunately, people who have become this connoisseur of churches and hop from one church to the next, and in the end it has really ruin them spiritually, you know? And I think that that's exactly what Lewis is getting at with that is how the enemy is tempting us. Or I guess I'm saying using the enemy to
right, not the
same,
Satan,
not, but that is often how we're tempted, and it's subtle at first. It's like, you know, you get frustrated with a church member, or you don't like the music, or whatever it may be, and then it just, you know, continue, or I guess over time draws us further and further away from the church.
Or even sometimes it's someone legitimately sins against you and does something wrong. But if we think of ourselves as forgiven sinners, then heaping forgiveness on our brothers and sisters should be the first place that we start, not leaving because you wronged me. But hey, let's start with forgiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another thing that Lewis frequently brings up is the idea of death. And he says towards the very end of the book, he describes actually the patient's death. And he says, "You die, and then you are beyond death. How could I have ever doubted?" What did you make of this, I guess, theme of death, and then kind of even the patient's own death?
Yeah, I love that quote. And just that last, I think that's like the last letter, right? I think it makes sense because he dies. The last letter. Yeah, so it's the last letter. And I when I read that, I feel like it's just a very stirring letter. And to some degree, I think that the way that Lewis sort of paints it almost makes you like see this idea of what Paul says when he says to live as Christ and to die as gain. Like this idea that there is a longing for death for Christians because of this like ultimate release and being in the presence of the Father. And I think the way he writes about it, of the patient is suddenly welcomed into what he was always made for, I think it's just a beautiful, it's interesting because you're reading it from the devil's perspective, so it's not beautiful in that sense, but thinking of it in those terms is, I think, just a beautiful way of understanding how Christians should think about death. We're not supposed to be afraid of it. We're not supposed to think of it as the end, really, because it's just the beginning in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and he also emphasizes the deaths occurring in wartime specifically, and he says there's a part more towards the beginning of the book that I really love, where he talks about how it's best to try to have men killed in kind of places of comfort, like nursing homes or hospitals, and that in those places they're promised life to the dying, and they're kind of able to put off the idea of their own mortality, whereas war really just starkly reinforces death, like, you know, and so he says in the book that war brings about this kind of moral it brings men out of this kind of moral stupor, and that it makes moral issues really come to a point that they do really have to wrestle with their own mortality. And I think in our day and age, we don't think about death enough. I think unlike almost every generation that's come before us, we just aren't presented with death in the same way. Like I think about in past generations, many children died young, people didn't live as long, and I'm thankful for modern medicine and thankful that those things aren't true anymore. But the downside of that has been that we really don't think about our own mortality often, and so I think we can often be deceived into just living distracted, worldly lives, and really drawn into the lure of the world and not reflect enough on our own mortality. And I think we should, as Christians, we should seek to actively do that, because even as Christians, we can often lose sight of our mortality and of the fact that we really do only have one life. And so I love the quote that says, "Only one life 'twill soon be past, only what's done for Christ will last." And so one thing, I think just an easy way to do that is it sounds weird, but to visit graveyards, you know, and my husband and I love going to see some of our heroes' graves like Spurgeon or Bunyan, people like that, and to reflect on the lives that they lived and to be faced with the stark reality that they are dead and gone, and we will be shortly before we know it as well.
Yeah, I think we're largely removed from the idea, like you were saying, even when people are dying, it's kind of largely sterilized for us a lot now. And so, not that I prefer to like watch people die, but I think like you were saying, it's so easy for us to think of ourselves as our death never being imminent, and just not recognize, like, we don't know if we have tomorrow, and to sort of put off like those ideas of these moral issues, and to put them off till way later, because we don't have to deal with that right now, as opposed to recognizing we could see Christ at any point, and we have no idea when that will be, and everything is pressing in an eternal an eternal significance, and that it's so important to keep that. I mean, it goes back to like what we were saying about time, where we're very much in the present and thinking of the eternal significance of things. And if we can keep in our minds, like, yes, death is certain. Resurrection is certain too for Christians, but death is certain, and we should be thinking about our lives in that context.
Yeah, and Psalm 90 tells us to learn to number our days so that we might gain a heart of wisdom. And so it is wise to number our days and to know our own mortality and to know the brevity of our lives, and that ultimately the number of all of our days are in God's hands. And so we don't have to fear the future or to fear mortality, because God holds our days in his hands. Another thing that stood out to me in thinking about death is this kind of draw towards worldliness. And he makes a statement towards the beginning of the book that has always really stood out to me. And he says, "It is funny how mortals always picture us putting things into their minds. In reality, our best work is done keeping things out." And so I think we do often think that the devil will tempt us, as we've talked about with these more overt sins like lust or addiction or some other very overt vice. But often the real trouble lies in the things that we're not doing, that we're not loving our neighbor, we're not praying, we're not in the word, we're not, there's lots of things that we should be doing that we're not doing. And I think slowly over time, the enemy can make us more and more content with the world, and we start to think less and less about eternity. And then we just drift into this worldliness without ever realizing it. And our natural bent, or the natural way we're going to drift if we're not on guard is not going to be towards holiness. It's going to be towards worldliness. And so if we want to be holier, we have to fight for that. We have to actively be pursuing that. We're not going to just, drift towards that.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to just be distracted. And I think you see that he mentions distraction a couple different times as his like tactic for deceiving the patient. And just this easy, as soon as he starts thinking about something important, remind him that he's hungry for lunch and like move him on to something else. And I think I think that's such a good quote, because you think of that and you're like, that's so true. That happens to me all the time. And
how much more? I mean, I know there's been distractions in every age, certainly, but I think especially in our present age, how much more are we bombarded by distractions of our smartphones and our emails, there's just so many distractions.
Yeah, I think overall, I mean, obviously we've sort of praised the Screwtape Letters and all the things that we really have drawn from it, and just the strength of the book. I think one of the things to keep in mind is Lewis's own warning before the book. He gives it in the introduction. He says there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel excessive and unhealthy interest in them. And so I think he believed in his time that the error was just general disbelief, and I think that's probably true for a sort of like post-Enlightenment culture. I think it changes in like subcultures. There may be more people that have more of a sort of like obsessive nature towards devils. But I think that keeping that in mind of like, it's very easy for us to just dismiss this idea of a dark realm existing. And it's even saying it for me feels weird, because I think it's just so easy to divorce that spiritual aspect of reality from our minds. But I mean, it's one of the things, I think the strength of reading something like the Screwtape Letters is to kind of keep that fresh in our mind and remind us of what powers we fight against. It's not humans. It's dark forces that we are supposed to be on guard against, and to like not be afraid of them because we're in Christ, but to just keep in mind that underneath a lot of the ideologies of the world that we see is a different force working. It's not just people.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think it's a great book to read. I think everyone should read it. It's short. It's not hard to read.
Yeah.
And it uses this fictional world to show us in a unique way that I don't think any other book that I've read has really been able to do. And so it is just something that shows us temptation and this dark realm like you're talking about, just in a very unique and a powerful way. And if you've never read anything by C.S. Lewis, I think that this is a great place to start. The Screwtape Letters and then potentially Mere Christianity are his two probably most popular books. And so I think the Screwtape Letters is a wonderful place to start. It's also a great book to discuss with someone else because it does bring up so many interesting ideas. And so I would encourage you to grab the book, read it yourself, read it with someone else, and to hopefully really profit from it. Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lydia.
Yeah.
And we look forward to being back with you next time. Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like access to more resources, we have a website at allthingspodcast.org. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode.